Hi, this is Paul Soltz from iPhone Dev TV. This is Challenge 2.4, and this is going to go over some common Xcode terms that you should be aware of and that you should be familiar with. So I'm just going to go through them. You can pause the video and take a look at the PDF document I have for this challenge. Try and go through all the terms that you can. Make a sketch pad where you can write down the terms and what they mean, and then maybe any questions you might have. And then I want you to come back to this video. So if you haven't already attempted the challenge, pause the video now. All right, so let's get started. I just want to go over the concepts first. We're going to break this up into several different slides so it's not too overwhelming. And the first several concepts are the important ones that we should understand already, but if you don't, I'm going to go over them. Xcode is a tool that Apple has developed for us to make iPhone apps, Mac apps, and any kind of sort of general programming that you want to do. So this is what we call an IDE. It's an integrated development environment, and it provides you all the tools that you need to write code, add new files, work with images, work with data files, and then turn those into apps that you can publish on the App Store. You can think of Xcode as Microsoft Word. We write papers in Microsoft Word, and in Xcode, we write computer programs. Objective-C is the programming language that we're going to use, and it's a modification of the C programming language. So we'll be writing a lot of Objective-C code, but we'll also be writing a little bit of C code just because Objective-C is based on C. Now, this is an object-oriented programming language, and this means that you can use objects, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Objective-C has a different syntax than other programming languages. It's similar to Smalltalk, and it uses the square brackets when it's doing a message send or a function call. Okay, iOS. This is the operating system for the iPhone and the iPad. Originally, it was just called the iPhone SDK, and now it's called the iOS SDK because it includes the iPad. And if Apple wants to add any other new devices, it's still going to be called iOS. All right, next up is Interface Builder. Now, in Xcode 3, this used to be a separate feature, a separate application from Xcode, where you could design interfaces for your Mac or your iPhone apps. In Xcode 4 and 5, they've sort of merged Interface Builder into Xcode. And so now whenever you open up an interface file that's either a nib file, you'll see either .xib, we call them nib files, or if you're working with an older application, you might see .nib, but most likely you'll only see the xib file extension. And the other one you'll see is the .storyboard file. That's sort of the newer version that allows you to have multiple screens in a single file so you can sort of connect the different screens without using any code. So if I refer to Interface Builder, I'm talking about the interface designer that's built into Xcode. Next up, we have method. So in Objective-C, we have this concept that we call a method. It's similar to a function. All right, both of these things are chunks of code that we can invoke so that we can sort of reuse the code that we write in our applications. Rather than rewriting everything all the time, we can break down our bigger processes. You can think of it sort of like assembling a desk or assembling a car. There's a bunch of different steps involved, and some of those steps you can repeat, like putting on the wheels. So we can create a method to tell the computer that it needs to pick up a wheel and put it onto the car and then screw in the bolts. We can do the same thing with a function. The difference here between the method and the function is that the method is for an object, like NS string or NS array. Those are objects. And a function is something that we get from functional programming, which has its roots in the C programming language. So that's where we're going to sort of mix and match Objective-C and C programming, is when we're using the C-style functions. Next, we have object. An object is the concept that we want to wrap ideas to include both state, and behavior. And what I mean by that is we want to represent your Honda Civic or something like that. Your Honda Civic's going to have a certain color, it's going to have a certain year, it's going to have an interior color, it's going to have a four-cylinder or a bigger engine, and all these different attributes are sort of what we call the state. So if we wanted to represent that car in an iPhone app, we'd have to store all of the information about the specific configuration, what kind of radio system it has, does it have GPS navigation, things like that. The other thing that we can include with an object is the concept of behavior. So we can say, all right, well, we want the car to be able to drive forward, or we want it to be able to stop when it's about to hit another object. And so we can write these methods that allow us to do these different calculations or display information or take actions on behalf of the object. And so this is a concept that we'll be working with a lot. And if you're not familiar with it, Google it and try and figure out a little more information about object-oriented programming. Next, we have import. This is a preprocessor statement, and we use this in conjunction with a file name in parentheses or in brackets, the angle brackets, to tell Xcode that we need to include more code from another file. And so this is just part of the process of creating apps. Rather than write everything from scratch ourselves, we can use code that Apple has written, or we can use open source code that other developers have written. And we can also use our own code. So import is a fundamental thing that we'll have to use in all of our iPhone apps. If we want to get the iPhone app to run, we're going to need to make sure that we're including all the code that we've written or other people have written to utilize the camera, GPS, and all kinds of different things on the iPhone platform. All right, next we have API. This is short for Application Programming Interface, and this is just a list of methods or functions that you can use with a chunk of code that either you've written or someone else has written. So if you wanted to interact with the Facebook platform, you would have to write code that used the Facebook API, and they have an iPhone version of that allows you to make queries to Facebook to get profile pictures, to get albums, to also upload and to publish different things on behalf of the user. So APIs are something that we'll see when we're working with the iPhone SDK. Every object that we work with and groups of objects like the UI table view that we'll use to show lists of information, we'll have to use their API in order to interact with those objects to display our information correctly. All right, let's move into some keywords. Keywords are words that we won't be able to use as variable names or function names because we'll have a compiler error and your program won't run. And so when you run into a situation like that, it's probably because you're using a word that you're not allowed to use because it's used by the system for the actual programming language itself. And a lot of these keywords are from the C programming language. So we have if, else if, for, in, and while. And we'll start with if. So if is a conditional statement. After it, we get the parentheses where we can give a condition. So we could say if true or if yes, and it would always do something. Or we could say if it's sunny outside, do something. Otherwise, we could use else to do something else. So we could say, well, if it's not sunny outside, else maybe wear a sweatshirt. And then we get into a situation where maybe we want more than just two conditions. So we use the else if to create more conditions. And so we can have as many conditions as we want to create. And here the else if allows us to specify another condition. So we could say else if it's snowing outside. And it just gives us a lot more options when we want to make our applications feel smarter or behave to different input or output so that our applications can really be useful for our users. Next, we have for. This is a keyword for the for loop. And normally there are three statements after it where we set up an index variable that we want to increment. up into a certain condition. And so we can use this to iterate over an array, or we could do this to repeat an action multiple times. The in keyword we use in the for loop, and it's a special way of writing it, and we can use this with our objects, especially our collections or our arrays. We can actually loop through, and we can grab individual objects and iterate in a similar way as we would with the normal for loop, but we can actually do this sort of shorthand notation that allows us to grab actual elements from the array as we're looping through it. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll be diving in a little bit and working with the NS array in this course. Then we have while. This is another type of loop, and this just allows you to continue to loop while a certain condition is true. All right, so we've got switch. This is similar to the if-else. This allows you to set up a condition and then have multiple cases that you can trigger. And so if you're interested in this, do a Google on switch with Objective-C and you'll find a lot more information on it. Next, we have struct. This is similar to object, except that there are no behavior associated with it. And so a struct you can think of as sort of a dumbed down class. We generally use them just to store information in a compact manner. So if we've got a lot of data, we'll probably create a struct or something that is a little bit more lightweight than an actual class, and we can pack the data in it more efficiently than with a full object. So this is a C thing, and we probably won't use them a whole lot, except when we're working with core graphics or we're working with the CG rect or the CG size or the CG point. After that, we've got the property. Now, anything that has an @ symbol in front of it is going to be an Objective-C keyword. And so these are special things. And so the property allows us to create a kind of like a public variable for our class, but it allows us to override the behavior for setting that variable and to add behavior for getting the variable. So depending on how your resources are, maybe you want to access a database or something, you can expose certain elements to the database using properties to mask the implementation details. Interface is used to create a new class in Objective-C, and implementation is also used to create a new class. The interface command normally goes in the .h file, and the implementation keyword goes in the .m file. And people will put the interface sometimes in the top of the .m file so that they can have sort of private properties or instance variables or methods. After you start a property, an interface, or an implementation, you always need the end block. And so it's sort of like an open brace and a closed brace. You need to start your declaration, then you need to end it. Now we have class, and we use this normally for declaring a class. If you create your own protocols, you'll have to do this so that you can reference a class within the protocol methods. A protocol is a way of establishing certain behaviors that a class can respond to. The iPhone SDK will use this so that the iPhone SDK will use this to create the delegate methods that we'll see when we're working with iPhone apps. We'll learn more about the protocol in this course. Next, we have IB outlet and IB action. The IB outlet is a special macro or preprocessor thing that Xcode can see, and then it allows us to be able to connect our UI text fields or our images in our iPhone app interface to our code. And so this is one of the ways that we can connect code to UI, and then we can modify the UI from our code in the methods that we write. The IB action is used to link buttons and things that might trigger something to a chunk of code. So we can respond to a user pressing a button, or we can respond to a user sliding a slider or moving some content around the screen. The IB action allows us to get that event and then to do something with it. Now, both IB outlet and IB action really are just void. So when the computer actually compiles our app, they don't really mean anything. They're more important for Xcode so that it can connect the interface to our code, and then it sort of just works kind of like magic. All right, so these are some types that we'll be seeing with Objective-C, and especially on the iPhone platform. So UI view, you can think of kind of like a canvas or a container. This is the base class for any user interface element, and it can be extended to create every other class. So we're using inheritance here, and the UI view just is a way of displaying content. And so you can customize that content however you want. The UI label is one of those customizations. The label allows us to display text on the screen, and you can update it in the iPhone app as you're working. So it's a nice way to give the user feedback or to tell the user what certain buttons or what certain text fields are related to. And so we can see that in the Contacts app on the iPhone. Next up, we have UI text field. If you need to get user input, UI text field is how we can get a little box that the user can tap in and then type in some input and then save it with the application. Then we have the UI button. This is a button that allows us to tap and give the user an ability to switch screens or to save information. Now you'll notice that all of these iPhone related classes start with UI, and this is a common trend that we'll see with a lot of the classes that we work with. Next we have float, double, and int. These are primitive data types, and they store numbers. So float and double both store decimal place numbers like 3.14. Float is less precise than double. If you need to do scientific work, I would definitely recommend working with double. If you do any kind of math calculations where precision is very important, that you don't have rounding errors, you'll want to work with double. Int is a whole number, so it's like an integer, and it can be positive or negative. So you can have negative 24 or positive 27 or 0. It's just a way to store information in our applications. Now we have NSString and NSNumber. Now you'll notice that these start with NS. This comes from Next Step, which was the company that Steve Jobs founded after being kicked out of Apple. And a lot of the stuff that they worked on was really foundational in the new operating system that Apple came out with when Steve Jobs came back to Apple after Apple bought Next Step. So we'll see that a lot in a lot of our classes. And here we have the NSString, which is one of the ways that we can create text in our applications. So there's a lot of different methods that the NSString provides because it is an object. We can append strings together. We can create paths for our documents to save on the disk. And we can convert numbers to strings and strings to numbers. Next, we have NSNumber. This is another object that Apple provides that allows us to work with all of the primitive data types, and we can create an object to represent them. So we'll want to create objects when we're working with collections, and that's one of the big areas where you'll see this used is when we have an array of information. We'll use the NS array, and in order to put numbers in there, you need to put them in order to put numbers in an array, they all need to be objects, and so we use the NSNumber to wrap up our float or our double or our int. Okay, so those are some more types that we'll see in Xcode. And just to wrap it up, we've got char or char, and this is a single character. This comes from C. You'll also hear of char strings or char star, and that would just be a C string. which is similar to NSString, except it's lower level and it doesn't have all the whiz-bang features that NSString has. After that, we have bool. This is used to represent true or false, or yes or no in all caps. Then we have long, which is just a bigger number, like the int. It can hold more information because it's more bytes long. After that, we have void. Void means nothing, so it's a common thing that we'll see on a return type for a function or a method. That means that nothing is going to return. And we'll see how that sort of works when we're working with more code. And lastly, we have ID. This essentially means void star, which means it's a pointer to anything. So ID you can think of as a pointer type, and it's something that we'll see in some Objective-C programs, though we won't use it a ton. All right, so the bonus one, if you didn't know, is what's the difference between the primitive data types versus objects. So a primitive data type is something like int or float. It's a number or it's a value, but it doesn't have any kind of functionality. Whereas an object is something that can have both state and behavior. And so the difference here is that objects can change their values, they can respond to different events and things like that, and they can change their own state, whereas a primitive data type is just like you tell the computer to store a number and it stores a number, and that's pretty much it. So Google this if you're still confused, you want to do a little bit more research so that you fully understand the concept. Otherwise, you can jump into code and play around with them. Bonus 2, the iPhone original SDK was the OS 2, and that was released on July 11th, 2008. So this was with the second iPhone, which was the iPhone 3G, not the original iPhone. So this was released the year after, and it really came out because everyone wanted to make iPhone apps, and the original iPhone SDK didn't have the ability to create apps. So Apple then spent the next year working to get it out, and then every year since has been updating the SDK with new features and new APIs that really allow us to take advantage of all the new hardware features that they've been adding, like the gyroscope, the accelerometer, the retina screen, a lot of audio stuff, working with the cameras to record slow motion video and things like that. So iOS has been changing a lot, and it was originally called iPhone OS because there was no iPad. Once the iPad came out, then the name changed. All right, so thank you for watching. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me at iPhonedev.tv.